I said in my heart, "Here are my convictions. What shall I do? Shall I be inactive and permit prejudice, the mother of abominations, to remain undisturbed? Or shall I venture to enlist in the ranks of those who, with the sword of truth, dare hold combat, prevailing in equity?" I contemplated for a while the manner in which I might best serve the people of color. As wealth was not mine, I saw no other means of benefiting them than by imparting to those of my own sex that were anxious to learn all the instructions I might be able to give, however small the amount. Prudence Crandall, a daughter, a wife, a teacher, a leader, a heroine. A pioneer who withstood storms of hatred while fighting for the self-evident truth that all men and women are created equal. Determined to help in any way possible, convinced that even her minuscule effort could make the difference, and it did. Unknowingly, she paved a road for history to travel upon and influence the world we now know. On September 3rd, in Hopkinton, Rhode Island, a baby girl was born into the Quaker family of Pardon and Esther Crandall. When she was 10, the small family moved to Canterbury, Connecticut. Young Prudence attended a Quaker boarding school founded by Moses Brown, an abolitionist. In 1830, Prudence went to Plainfield, Connecticut, where she became a teacher at a school for girls. America in the early 1830s was rapidly changing. The slave trade that had been around since the founding of the country was faltering. The anti-slavery movement was gathering steam. In the South, Nat Turner, an African-American from Virginia, led a slave revolt that shook the nation. Beginning with the murder of his owners, Turner rallied around 70 slaves who killed 55 white women, children, and men over the course of 2 days as an act of rebellion against slavery. Although in the South, the revolts only caused harsher laws against slaves to be sanctioned, it fueled abolitionist movements in the North, who fought to emancipate the slaves as well. William Lloyd Garrison was the publisher of a newspaper, The Liberator. After the upset in Virginia, Garrison released an article in support of Nat Turner. Across the nation, people were turning against slavery and standing up.
By the 1830s, you have a growing movement of both white people and African-American people who are opposed to slavery and who are working together. You have anti-slavery societies and abolitionist societies that are lobbying and writing. There are very important African abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, like Sojourner Truth. And you also have the Fugitive Slave Act allows slave owners in the South to go into northern states and retrieve runaway slaves. And so you have organizations called vigilante societies that work to protect runaway people who have come north for their freedom.
In 1831, Prudence Crandall founded the Canterbury Female Boarding School. In 1832, a young African-American girl approached Prudence Crandall. Sarah Harris was a daughter of a lucrative farmer and had attended her district school. She now yearned to become a teacher and longed to complete her education.
Sarah Harris was very courageous. She was focused. She really wanted education so that she could teach other African-American students and start her own school.
She asked Crandall to admit her to her school. After much consideration, with an open mind, Prudence Crandall agreed. However, even in being the North, the community of Canterbury was appalled. They fought against the admission, forcing Crandall to shut the school down for the year. When she reopened it, instead of kicking out Sarah Harris, she threw out everyone else and made the school for black women exclusively, much to the town's dismay.
There was no public education open to everyone as we have today. So the people who were being educated were mostly white men, a handful of white women, and very few people of color.
She recruited middle-class African Americans from all over the Northeast.
her response was so just out of left field, I think, in a way. When there was initially resistance to her taking on this one black student in her school, she just went completely a place that I don't think anyone expected, that she dismissed all these white students.
She gathered support as well. William Lloyd Garrison released ads for the school for the reception of young ladies and little misses of color. Terms, $25 per quarter, one-half paid in advance. The school reopened in April 1833 with 20 students. The citizens of Connecticut were not thrilled. They fought and created the Black Law, banning the teaching of non-resident African Americans without permission from the town. On these charges, Crandall was arrested and put to trial. Crandall spent a night in jail. As she did, word of her case spread across the country. She was released from her cell and awaited trial, teaching all the while. The men of the town began to threaten, then attack the school. They even poisoned the well water. Prudence Crandall determinedly stood her ground, but this defiance caused criticism from the townsmen. The first trial resulted in no verdict. Crandall's lawyers argued the Black Law as unconstitutional and that black people had equal rights to everyone else. The jury was deadlocked.
But her attorneys were making the case that, based on the fact that non-whites were in fact citizens under the U.S. Constitution, and that their rights were being violated by this black law that made this school illegal in the state of Connecticut. And if at that time in the 1830s, if they had ruled on that, the case could have gone on to the U.S. Supreme Court, and 30 years before the Civil War broke out, they could have been forced to address that question.
The second trial had her convicted. An attorney, Andrew T. Judson, claimed the law was constitutional because African Americans were not citizens, so the Constitution was inapplicable. This swayed the jury to vote her guilty. The third, with Connecticut Supreme Court, overturned the conviction and dismissed the case. The higher court said that there was not enough information to sentence her. Even after the case was dropped, mobs of men continued to vandalize the school. In 1834, the school had to close for good. Prudence Crandall eventually fled from Canterbury with her husband, Reverend Calvin Philo. They moved to Illinois, where Crandall continued to advocate for women's rights and racial equality. She even opened a small school in her home. In 1886, the state of Connecticut gave her a $400 annual pension for the suffering they inflicted upon her. She later moved to Kansas with her brother, Hezekiah. Prudence Crandall died on January 26, 1890, in Elk Falls, Kansas, but her legacy did not. Excerpts from her trial were used in Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857 and Brown v. the Board of Education in 1954.
Like in Brown versus Board of Education, they actually quoted the Prudence Crandall case.
Her school is now a National Historic Landmark, and in 1995, she was named Connecticut's State Heroine. Her whole life, a struggle to promote racial and educational equality. The impact she had on the country when she was alive and dead is unimaginable.
She opened up the whole process to getting equal education for African Americans in Connecticut. Basically opened up the door to having African American students in a bunch of other academies, later on going to like Norwich Free Academy or Bacon Academy, Colchester, and then it just continued from there on.
One woman who persevered to achieve a goal unachievable in her time.
She was a suffragette, she was an abolitionist, she was an educator, and she was a woman that owned her own business.
Prudence Crandall, a daughter, a wife, a teacher, a leader, a heroine.